top. Leo, the guy from Mexico that works with us, he's there pruning on the left, and so that's all leafier prunings, and so the stems will be higher carbon, but those leaves will have a lot of nitrogen in them. I'll go back through the same day usually that he's pruning, mow that in. That leaf part will go into the soil pretty quickly. The branches part will take a little longer. But as it's surface applied and working in, you've got these wonderful reserves of habitat for these organisms, all kinds of organisms. You'll have, places where there's a bunch of organic matter, and then you go underneath that and you look at what's running around there, and it says, Helen actually knows the names of a lot of these things that are running around there. I don't, but there's a lot of stuff running around. And then there's always something that's getting added. So soils, they're really active during the time of the year when there's the right amount of moisture, which we irrigate, so we kind of keep that always where we think we want it. But it also then some kind of a carbon source. When it's warm, that carbon source, those organisms are happy and they're moving around and they're able to eat that stuff and pull it down. And when it's cold, everything kind of slows down or stops, and it takes longer for that carbon source to get pulled in. But the leaves on these trees in the fall are coming down. The prunings will come down. We're kind of always pruning. So any time of the year, there might be prunings that are getting mowed in. So it's always working its way in for 6 months or 8 months, in kind of spring, summer, and fall. Everything's working kind of quicker. But in the winter, everything slows down. But we're always adding different kinds of compost or of carbon source. And so then this next picture is something that from the early years of trying to figure out, well, what do I want to do with this soil test? And then I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, okay, so what does this even mean? Where do I want to be with it? And so what are the numbers? Where do I want to get to? So generally farmers do soil testing, and they look at the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the NPK, and they look at pH. But, in reality, it comes up with there's 15 different things that we generally test for. And so of all of those things, there's going to be highs and lows. If you get excesses of any of them or you get too low of any of them, a lot of times it kind of creates imbalances in the soil. You don't get some nutrient into the plant because this other one's excessive, or anyway, there's balances that you need to play with. On our website, woodleaffarm.com, I have a 4 or 5 page handout that kind of goes through each mineral, if it's low or if it's high, what are you supposed to be looking for, how do you find an organic, what do you use as an organic mineral amendment to kind of change these things, and then where, in that handout, I kind of explain where I think, is a good place to be for balancing, where do you want that balance, and so it's just like our bodies want to have balanced nutrition. Well, these organisms in the soil, the trees ultimately need, I think, balanced nutrition to have disease suppression, insect suppression too. And so the stronger we can build these, any plant, but perennial plants that we mostly grow, the better everything is going to be. We'll have less problems that we have to contend with. So this soil probe is kind of showing at the one end, you can see the right on the surface is the first inch or so is a lot of organic matter, and as you work your way down, less. If you get all the way to the right, you can see the kind of subsoil that hasn't quite changed. Well, that's about 10 inches down, so we've got, looks like about 8 or 9 inches where there's enough oxygen getting down 8 or 9 inches that those organisms in the soil are really going to do pretty well. They're going to have a happy time working their way up and down, making exchange with roots so that the roots have better nutrition, and then they're going to have enough oxygen and food sources and carbon food sources that take time to break down. So what you're looking for, I think, is all stages of quick release carbon sources and longer term, lignaceous stuff that doesn't break down that quickly and turns into a humus that's going to be there for a long time. I mean, you read in the books, it's like generations or hundreds of years that this humus particle can have exchange sites. That might be pushing it, but I've definitely read 1,000 years once I read. Anyway, so soil balancing is something, and getting your organic matter to where it's really working for you. So one of our main off-farm input is yard waste compost. So, I think it was about 15 or 20 years ago, all of the dumps were mandated half of their refuge had to be recycled. So the way they did it was anything green coming into the dump sites was, diverted off and then composted. And then sometimes some of the yards, do a good job of making a good compost that gets on the OMRI list, or a list that organic farmers can use. And so there's one close to us, about 20 miles away. And so we buy compost from this organically approved site and get this green waste compost, which has the branches, same as the orchard, the leaves, same as our orchard, and then grass clippings, which would be the grass that we mow. So not so different, but then composted, hauled onto the farm, and then we just put a dusting. You can see two of the pictures, the one with the leaves on it, the far left, shows just kind of what the dusting is on that leaf, which is 2 tons to the acre, and it really doesn't look like that much, and it isn't, but it really gives, you can just feel the trees, especially if they've been through a long hot season, or the fertility, it's been a long wet spring, which we actually haven't had in a while. But if you get those times where things are leached out, you put on this little bit of compost and the trees really respond, or the vegetables. And so you can see the bottom right, just kind of the high carbon, you want to get it as broken down as you can, but you also want to see that it's from, woody material. And so since I've switched to just using this green waste compost, it's been where my organic matter has been able to go up, kind of considerably. I'll have an organic matter chart in a minute to kind of show what that does. But when I met Helen, and she was doing research on, I think, 6 or 7 organic farms. I think I turned into the 7th organic farm. She came to visit, and she was looking at my system and looking through my records and trying to figure out, all what I was doing. And she was like lit up and says, "Do you know you're a veganic farmer?" And so I said, "Well, what's that?" And she said, "Well, I'm vegan. It means that, you're farming without using any animal products." And I said, "Oh, cool, I guess." So anyway, I'm a veganic farmer, which is kind of cool. And so then one of the things that a lot of farms have issue with is they're adding back, fertilizers. And so nitrogen is one of the ones that, certainly green things up. And it's one of the things that farmers often pay a lot of attention to. And so what now that I'm one of the 7 farms that Helen's researching, and so anyway, I hear these academics talk about different systems, and I've heard this word leaky quite a bit. And so leaky nitrogen system means that you've got that nitrate nitrogen that goes into the groundwater, or that, goes off of the surface of the land and into the waterways. And so that first, back in the 80s when I used manure, you've got my highest numbers from way back there, and then generally I'm in the what most farmers would consider deficient nitrogen, but with the one way some soil scientists talk about it is closely coupled nitrogen. So it's kind of where you don't have a lot of nitrogen available, but there's enough different places for nitrogen around that the organisms break it off, and the bacteria fix some out of the air and pull it down. And there's different ways that it's around enough that you look at the trees. We'll get to more pictures of the trees, and they pretty much always look pretty good. And those wet springs, sometimes they're having issues, but in general, it doesn't take much. If anything, I think I overdo how much nitrogen I use. And then this is what got me going on all this, trying to figure out farming. It was the soil organic matter. So back in the probably late 80s, early 90s, I started doing no-till. And then Helen did no-till for 20 years in Montana on a farm that she had there, trying to figure out what does that mean. And so what I found with no-till was you were able to, even in gardening, I did a 1/4 acre, 1/2 acre of vegetables. We do a little bit more now. Anyway, that 2% organic matter, which was, kind of where I started at Woodleaf Farm, was able to go up, slowly. But 3 or 4 years down the line, you were able to double it. So we went from 2 or so percent to 4%. It was just like, that's significant. And then managing no-till, well, that's a different story. And so we've come up with, and I'll explain the system that we're using now for how we make it on our farm, relatively easy to do no-till. But you can see in this chart how it goes from, generally 2% or so, and then it keeps working its way upward. Now I've got a lot of fields at over 5 and 6%, and even the worst ones are, 3.5 and 4%. So doubling and tripling of organic matter is kind of what gets me most excited, actually. And so in each little bit of each percent of soil organic matter, you release all of this nutrition. So for each time I get another percent of organic matter, I've got more of a reserve of nutrition that can go into those plants without having to add anything. But by adding something, I can keep that organic matter stable or rising. And so that's the plan, is just to keep adding back our woody, branches and grasses, and then the little bit of compost. The 4 tons per acre of compost is what we've been adding lately, and it's, if anything, a little too much, but it's pretty inexpensive, and everything really likes it, but we actually have to do more pruning because we probably have a little more vigor than we need.